the chapters and articles related to the president, the vice president, the council of minister, parliament, how it constituted, what is all goes, and we have also included one additional topic, that is ordinance. Now to discuss, to debate upon, to deliberate upon the same today, we have with us Meghnad sir. I know all people are aware that who he is. I need not to give a very broad introduction, but for the people who don't know him, I barely doubt there will be any people who don't know you. So he is associate editor at News Laundry. He has been author of a book called Parliamentary. He has also been ex-Lamb Fellow. For the people who are friendly with the YouTube, you must have aware his Constitution series and his all YouTube and informative video series on News Laundry. So, and we were preparing the themes, I could not think of any person other than Sir to make us understand the whole concept. So, without wasting any of much time, it's over to you, sir. And thank you once again for devoting your time.
Thanks. Guys, can you turn on your cameras if possible? I want to see your faces. Have you enabled the thing, like, or they can't turn it on? What is this?
I have enabled the setting. People, you can turn on your cameras.
Yeah, please do. I'll tell you the reason why. So the thing about online lectures is that I can just keep talking endlessly, and then I will have no idea whether you're receiving the information or not. So I rather prefer to see people when talking. No, nobody. But then how do I talk to people? That's my question. So I like, do they chat or do they?
Yeah, they put questions, their clarification through chat box. They also use their mic.
Oh, you can use your microphones also. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So when you want to turn on your camera, please do. I will start. First up, hello everyone, and I am Meghnad. I am not a lawyer. I am not exactly, you know, formally educated in the field of law or policy or anything of that sort. And till now, I think you've had 7 lectures, if I'm not wrong. Seven lectures, right? So yeah, 6 lectures. This is the 7th one. And I saw the list of people that have come before this, and of course they have like formal education in this, and they are professors, etc. So I was a little surprised why I am included in this, but let's get on to it. The thing is that the topic that is given to me is the union, right, and the parliament, and council of ministers, etc. But I could see that before this you've already had some classes which have touched upon this. If I'm not wrong, you have had you have had a whole class on Constitution of India. You had a constitutional concepts and union and citizenship already. State of law, fundamental rights, both of 2 classes on fundamental, 3 classes on fundamental rights. So what I am going to do, I think I'm going to not stick to what this is exactly, but overall touch upon it, like overall as a concept, because that is what I do on a regular basis. So first up, just know what my audience is like. So tell us, are you lawyers? Are you students? What are you doing? Can Can you tell us, or are all of you lawyers, or are you studying law? Studying law. Aprajita says, okay, law students. All of you are law students. Okay. I mean, at least two of you are. Okay, guys, you have to talk to me, okay? Throughout this whole thing, you have to talk to me. I mean, you're not turning on your camera. Okay, fine, I get it. But this is going to be like an ultra intensive interactive class in the process of becoming lawyers. Okay, all of you mostly. Okay. So I am, as I said, I am not formally educated in law or policy or etc. So let me just set some context about myself and why I'm here and why I do what I do, so that whatever I tell you after this, you will have like an idea of what is going on. So are you guys aware of my work? Have you seen my videos, or do you know who I am? I mean, Gautam here just was kind enough to say that, oh, needs no introduction and all, but I'm not, I'm not so confident, guys. Please, so I hope you're aware of my work, or have you been following me? Do you know what I do? I would like to hear some no's. Hmm. No, nobody. Wow, everybody knows me. That's amazing. Anyway, yeah, guys, again, please interact. Please talk. I missed today's nuisance episode. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let me just give you a quick background. Anyway, I'm just assuming nobody knows. So, I come from Nagpur. I studied CA formally, two exams, but I sucked at it, so I kind of quit. And I got into this fellowship called Legislative Assistance to Members of Parliament, which is run by this organization called PRS Legislative. You must be familiar of that organization. What they do is they pick up 50 kids between the age of 20 to 25 from all across the country, and they assign them to random MPs to work for a year as a legislative aide or a research assistant. So our job used to be basically reading these complicated pieces of legislation and then making briefs on them and then giving it to our MPs, and also helping them with speeches, helping them with political engagements, all that sort of thing. Now, the thing is though that they picked students. I mean, the fellows from all sorts of backgrounds, and they gave them a 1 month training on basically what you are doing right now, all the classes that you had, something similar. And they told us how parliament works. They told us how how democracy functions essentially, and then they just threw us to work with MPs. Now, what happened there is that you realize that our members of parliament also come from very differing backgrounds. Like there are very few are actually lawyers or trained in reading laws or interpreting them or anything of that sort. Especially drafting comes even much further than that, right? So you have to understand that. And you are all law students, so you know how there is a big difference between actually crafting a law and interpreting a law. So now we are in this situation where there are like these bunch of MPs who have, I mean, legitimately have difficulty understanding laws or the nuances within them, etc. So our job was to read those bills, collect information, collect data, talk to experts, etc., and get them the brief required for them to make an informed decision, whether to vote yes, no, speeches, that sort of thing. Um, So after that, basically after doing that for a year, I continued doing that for 7 years, and I've worked with multiple MPs across party lines. I've worked in 5 states now, with like different MPs of 5 states. Then after this the 7th year, so I've worked during the UPA 2, and also when Modi ji came in, I worked 3 years after that, 3 to 3.5 years after that. Um, Guys, there's going to be a lot of political content coming your way this time, okay? So please bear with me. Yeah, so I worked for 7 years, and then I realized something, that in those 7 years I had done very little in life. Like, as in, like, you would think that working with powerful legislators who have a say in policy, etc., you would get to do a lot of things in 7 years, like, actually make amendments to laws, which took me like 3 years to actually learn how to write a first amendment, right? So you can imagine, like, MPs, when in their first term, it's an education process for them as well. So, like, first term is pretty much ineffective for them as well, and if they get re-elected, then they become effective, because then they finally wrap their heads around how parliament functions, and how laws are made, and how amendments are made, and all of that sort of thing. Um, so yeah, so, like, in those 7 years, the one thing that we managed to do was turn was to declare bamboo as a grass instead of a tree, right? So, like, and that we did through a private members bill, and we proposed this private members bill back in 2013, and it got passed by the Modi government in 2017 as their own bill. But we had drafted the original one, so we were super happy, like the six of us who did that work. And after that, um, y- you know uh, one sort of faces an existential crisis, right? Where you're wondering, why is it that our democracy just doesn't seem to function as you want it to? And there can be many ways to look at it, right? You can ask why, you know bad laws are passed, right? You can ask why MPs are ineffective. You can ask why governments tend to focus on things which are benefiting just a certain number of people versus, like, the masses. So these sort of questions kept coming in. So then I decided that these skills that I have accumulated over the 7 years, I would just use them to educate the public. So, I instead of giving briefs to MPs, I will just give briefs to people. So then I started writing, and I started doing videos. I did a constitution series. I covered a lot in those 2 seasons, where we talk about just the basic things about why you vote, how the parliament functions, how the judiciary functions, how everything functions. And then the second season is more about inequality, liberty, free speech, rights. So it covers those two aspects in 2 seasons. So if you are interested, you can go and watch those as well. And now I am a associate editor at newslaundry.com. I am more closer to the media space of media, sort of, let's say, the fourth pillar than the first pillar. I went from the first to the fourth very fast. But I still track parliament, I still track policy, and I try to simplify it and make videos, etc. So that is the overall context of what I do right now. So as you can see, the lecture that I'm about to give, lecture, I wouldn't even call it a lecture, the talk or the interaction that we are about to have is going to be a little out there. I am not going to go the traditional academic way. I am going to try and help you think about a few things, right? And you guys are law students, and I have friends who are law students, and I have interacted with many lawyers. And one constant complaint about our general education system is that there is no connection of theory with reality, and it is a little bothersome, right? Like for instance, like you will learn everything about the constitution, you will learn everything about how parliament functions or whatever, but then something like a farm bill comes in, like the 3 farm bills, you must have tracked that, hopefully. It comes in, and suddenly you see that every rule book that you had gone by or held sacrosanct or whatever is just steamrolled through, and then it just doesn't matter anymore, right? So practically speaking, laws are important, but only if they are followed, or if everybody understands the intention behind why those laws exist at all, right? If you know that the parliament functions according to a certain rule book, the rules. There is one rule, for instance, that you cannot cross between, when you are walking around, you cannot cross between the speaker and the person who is speaking. You cannot cross them like this. That's actually in the rule book, right? So there are literally rules to this extent in the parliament rule book about procedures and how to follow them. But ultimately, if you don't know the intention behind them, it doesn't matter what it is, right? And I think that is one of the biggest problems that we are sort of facing today, where you are knowledgeable people, you are studying law, but if you are not able to communicate the basic aspects of lawmaking, or why you even need laws, or why a society needs laws, it kind of becomes pointless, because then it becomes like a very um, elite sort of group of people making, interpreting, analyzing laws which are very devoid of reality. And that is something that I've seen happen across the years, and I think that is very harmful. So that is where people like me come in, where my singular motive in life right now is to simplify as much as I can, so that the overall masses sort of understand it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk a little bit about um, just my understanding of our democracy through a story, because as I was introduced, I'm a satirist. Okay, so I wrote a novel which is a satire. So I mean, if you came here expecting something else, then I'm really sorry. So I'm just going to tell you this one story that I had created, which sort of explains in very simple terms how our democracy works, and what I see are the 4 biggest flaws in our democracy currently, right? And through this story, I will also explain how each pillar of our democracy works, right? And how it affects society. So I hope that's okay. So are you guys all right? Are you guys ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay, awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. And if you have any sort of questions throughout this, right, please leave them in chat. I do a lot of live streams, so there is usually a chat that is incredibly active, and I really like that. So if you want to talk amongst each other in chat also, I am happy, absolutely happy. Okay, so yeah, so like I'm used to that sort of format. So please, if you have questions, if you want to interrupt, if you want to do anything of that sort, I am open to it. I will keep looking at the chat here. Okay, so I'll just share my presentation. Yeah, can you guys see it? Yeah, okay, awesome. Awesome, I can see it too. Okay, so I call this the skyscraper of democracy. Okay, um, I've done a few talks about this before, short ones, but I will give you a detailed version because we have a lot of time. Okay, so I came up with this story because it was I felt that it was important to sort of capture the essence of our democracy in a very visual format, which sort of everybody relates to, or the people who are reading and watching my stuff relate to. So I came up with this thing called skyscraper of democracy, which I'm going to take you through. Okay, right. So this is forgive my drawing. Uh, and this is the skyscraper. Okay, So imagine that our democracy is a gigantic skyscraper, right? As you can see on the screen. Um, this is like 100-floor skyscraper where if you can see it's standing on 4 pillars below, and there are like levels to it, different sort of levels about how the skyscraper looks. um, you people who are watching this right now are basically considered to be the top 10% of society. I mean, I can say this with confidence because uh, I mean, you might have Netflix connections, you might have internet connections. The fact that you are listening to an entire lecture series about constitutional law pretty much makes you one of the elite in our society, right? So you live up top, like I pointed out there, you live up top, and while the 90% of the population or more, it lives below you, right? Now, in this giant skyscraper, what is currently happening is that the top uh, 10 floors, the top 10 floors of the skyscraper are extremely aspirational people, right? They're extremely aspirational people because they want really, really shiny things. They want a lot of they want comforts, they want luxuries, they want development, right? So whereas the people who live below, there are more basic necessities that they are looking for, like sanitation, water, housing, a lot of other basic needs that the people in the top floor have. We are one of the most unequal societies in the world right now. So what happens is that in this skyscraper, this is standing on 4 pillars. You can see below. There's the legislatures, there's the executive, there's the judiciary, and there's the media. Now these pillars are cracked, very badly drawn cracks. They are cracked and they are sort of old, and it's almost seems like the people on the top, which is us, which are studying constitutional law and all of that, are not able to see what is going on below, right? Because the people amongst us, we are looking upwards, we want more development, we want our skyscraper to be taller, we want our skyscraper to be shinier. We see other skyscrapers which are better than us, and we are like, yeah, we want that. So we want sort of those things to happen. Now our 4 pillars, they have very specific jobs, right? They're very specific jobs. Quickly, the legislature is supposed to make laws, right? Now suppose our legislature here consists of people who are elected from amongst us, from throughout the whole skyscraper. They're elected from amongst us. Uh, a law is proposed, and from amongst them there will be a government that is formed from the ruling party, from the governing party. I keep catching myself when I say ruling. From the governing party, they would be the majority party. They would be a government formed. There will be a council of ministers, and there will be a prime minister. And they will be the ones who will be proposing laws, right? Now suppose the government of the day proposes a law that development is what we need, so let there be a mall on top of the skyscraper, right? There can be a helipad there can be a golf course there can be so many things that we all seem to want. uh, Now that is the law they will make, which is let there be a mall, right? The executive comes in. The executive, which is the bureaucracy, their job is to make it happen. Now these executives would be the one who would be figuring out the little details within the laws, which is which cement manufacturer will supply the concrete. What will the mall have? Will it have a Starbucks or will it have a CCD? There will be all sorts of little details which will be chalked out, and then the executives will issue tenders to actually make it happen, right? So then contractors will come in and they will start construction of this mall. Now we come to the judiciary, which has essentially two jobs. One is, of course, whenever two parties within this skyscraper they get they sort of start fighting amongst each other. They have they have conflict amongst each other. They will apply the laws that were made by the legislature on that conflict, and then they'll figure out which is correct and which is wrong. So then, one part, I mean, they will deliver justice that way. The second job they have is that they have to keep a watch on the other pillars and their performance. So, for instance, the judiciary can take cognizance of the fact that the mall is not being built in the correct way, or they are not building it fast enough, or something of that sort. So, basically, their job is to also keep a watch on the legislature and executive and their performance. Right now, that's the job of the judiciary. Now comes the media. Right, the media's job is extremely important. Right, and this is the fourth pillar. It's a concrete pillar, but it might as well be a bamboo pillar actually. So the media's job is simple. The media's job is to keep a watch on all of these pillars. Of course, they have to look at the flaws, they have to look at how they are functioning, etc. But their other job is to also sort of amplify the voices of the lower floors, because the media's job is to amplify the needs and wants of the entire skyscraper, but especially the vulnerable. Right, and their job is to make our legislature, executive and judiciary aware of the things that are going on in the skyscraper, but also the other citizens about what is going on in the skyscraper, because that is the only way they can make informed decisions about who they can vote for, who they can have in the next legislature, or who will represent them. Right, that's the job of the media. Now if you look at it very simply, it goes like this. It's a cycle. Right, so there is a cycle which goes like, first there's a make laws, then there is implement laws, then there is review laws, and then there is improve on existing laws, and then there is hashtag outrage. Right, the media's job is to kind of outrage. Right, their job is to basically highlight flaws in current laws, or like implementations of them, and then make sure that the legislature acts on it, and then the whole process follows. So it's like a cycle. Right, so and what drives this cycle essentially is the outrage or the public opinion. And this is basically how the skyscraper is supposed to function. Right, this is how it is supposed to function in a very simple way. Now there are four big flaws in all of these: legislature, executive, judiciary and media, which I call the cracks. Right, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is based on my experience. These are basically the main flaws as I see them in all of these four pillars, which nobody seems to be talking about also. Legislature. Are you guys aware of this law called anti-defection?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Can someone tell us what anti-defection is? Anyone? Anyone?
Sir, it was a law means which was passed because the MPs violate their party lines and vote against their party lines. It was a law that their means seat will get cancelled or.
Yes, absolutely. That's actually correct. Essentially, that law was made in 1985 by the last majority government we had, which is the Rajiv Gandhi government. And what it says, it's really funny because it's called the Ayaram Gayaram law also sometimes. There was this one gentleman from Haryana. Yes, Aprajita, yes, that's actually true. But there is another part to it, right? And I'll explain both of those. So there was this MP from Haryana who basically switched parties thrice in the same day, and people were like, "Boss, this is this is not cool." I mean, they were like, "Ye nahi ho sakta." So they passed this law, which essentially says that once you are elected on the ticket of a certain party, you cannot change them through the duration of how long you are the elected representative. But there is a second part to it. There is a part two to the anti-defection law, that not only are you supposed to not switch parties, but you're also not supposed to go against the whip of the party. Which means that if the party whip or the party leadership tells you that you have to vote on a bill in a certain way, then you have to vote that way. Otherwise, you lose your seat. You can be challenged and you can be basically kicked out. And that, I feel like, turns our democracy into very much a theoretical democracy, right? Because if you look at it, there are a very few top parties which have a gigantic amount of MPs, and this law reduces our MPs to button pushing bodies, essentially, or seat occupying button pushing bodies, which is, they lose interest in even reading about the law, because anyway the party leadership is going to tell them how to vote, so why even apply your brain there? Then they, if for instance in our skyscraper example, there is a MP from the 10th floor who is like, in my area there is very crappy sanitation. Now he's from the governing party, or from any other party. Let's take a regional party or whatever. Now if the regional party boss tells him to vote yes on this mall bill instead of voting yes for, say, a sanitation bill, which, I mean, just an example, the person will have to vote on a mall. But these people who live on the 10th floor, they have nothing to do with the mall. Literally, they're like so far away, they have nothing to do with it. So they basically, he's forced to vote on it, otherwise gets kicked out of parliament. Now that, I think, is a very big flaw of our democracy, which not many people talk about, right? Essentially, if you can imagine, changing the constitution becomes extremely simple, because say there are like 5 parties, 6 parties which have the most number of more than two-thirds seats in both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Then all the say the prime minister or the minister who is proposing the constitutional amendment will have to do is make 5 phone calls to 5 party leaders, and they will be like, what do you need in exchange? And they'll be like, we will need, say, this or that project in exchange, or whatever it is. They can negotiate that way, or we need an alliance, or there can be many things that can be offered. So they will basically then force their MPs to vote to change the constitution. And that to me is extremely bizarre and also scary, right? So that is one of the cracks in our legislature, right? Now, moving on to the executive. Now, tell us, you guys have read the constitution. Article 311, do you know? Anyone? Are you furiously Googling it? It's okay, I'll give you time. Article 311. Nobody? Well. Okay, so Article 311 is about, yes, transfer of public servants. Yeah, go ahead.
So can I answer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Your 311 says that any person who is in service, like in any civil service, cannot be fired without giving notice, I guess. That is
Yes,
311.
absolutely. So 311 is about protecting our executive, right? So they cannot be dismissed from service. You know, it's really if you know any bureaucrats, you might know some bureaucrats. It's you can talk to them and you'll find out that it's really about how bureaucracy is more about closeness to power rather than their performance, right? So if one bureaucrat sort of goes against the wishes of the government in power, or whatever it is, they constantly keep getting transferred. Like there's this gentleman called Ashok Khemka, you must have heard. He was transferred in like for like some 45 times in 20 years or something ridiculous of that sort. Essentially, he was not even able to live in one place for 6 months. Um, and the reason why these things happen is because bureaucracy is not that independent, right? They have to do what the government asks them to do, or face the consequences. Now, the executive essentially um, is protected by this 311 law, but what this allows is also that if they perform badly, they cannot be fired. So one day a bureaucrat would be like, say, working on horticulture in Sikkim. Next day they will work in sanitation in Orissa. The next year they'll work on in some other place, in the south of India or whatever, on some other topic, and then they'll start working on defense procurement, right? And they keep getting transferred in their earlier years until they reach a point where they're in Delhi, they are in ministries, or they are in, if it comes to state governments, they're in like um, top state legislatures, or like serving the government there. It takes a while, but the performance review is not a thing there, where you cannot judge the executive's performance based on what they're delivering because of this one very big flaw in our sort of executive system. Um, I mean, there is the other point to it that, maybe they will be harassed, and then if they don't listen to it, then they'll just get fired. So it's protecting them. But to a large extent, I feel like that is one big flaw in our democracy, right? Then we come to the judiciary. Can someone guess what is the biggest flaw in our judiciary? Which I would love to see some
Appointment of
guesses.
judges.
Oh yes, पहले में ही पता चल गया that they can get jobs post retirement, appointment. Yes, any others? Post retirement jobs, I agree, that is one more thing.
So I
Parliament.
guess collegium system.
Collegium, yes, absolutely.
So because
Promote-
Chief Justice and the other judges are electing and just appointing the other judges, so it's the
Yes.
flaw in that.
Absolutely. So I agree, and that was what I was coming to, the collegium system, right? The collegium system, I feel, is extremely closed off. It's like a black box, and where brother judges choose other brother judges, because it actually perpetuates a lot of dynastic, sort of tendencies within the top judiciary. It also like leads to a lot of sexism, it leads to casteism, it leads to a host of other problems, right? It leads to English bias. Like I've heard stories of judges basically putting lawyers down because their English is not so good. It leads to elitism. So I feel like in a way the collegium system is one of the biggest reasons why our judiciary doesn't function the way it should. Why it does not listen to the vulnerable. In most ways it does not listen to the voices of the vulnerable, because there is a giant amount of bias at place there, just through representation. And of course, like you have also pointed out, they can get jobs post retirement. There is no cool down period. I mean, they can get in promotions also. Of course, the collegium system also works on that level. So it's very harmful that way. I don't understand why not many people actually challenge it or talk about it much. I think back in 2017, the Supreme Court had said that they will now make it transparent or something, the collegium system, the appointment or the rationale behind it. But they had used some weird line like, this is being done to ensure transparency but also maintain confidentiality. So which one is it? I did not understand what was going on there, but that's a big problem, right? Now the media. Let's come to the media. Can you tell me what the problem might be in the media? The one big flaw. Go crazy, guys. Go crazy. Not providing right information. All right. Bias. Okay. Media trials. Okay. Bias. Republic TV. Okay. TRP. Get revenue from government so they don't run stories that cast government. Okay. Close. Close. NDTV, TRP. Irony is they are concerned about TRP. Yeah. Okay. Fair. Fair. But I think you're getting close. According to me, the biggest flaw in our media, fake news. Okay, fake news, interference of government. Cool. No checks and balance. Okay, fair. Right. I think you guys are close when you say TRP. TRP. It's you know, the biggest flaw is the business model right now. The business model of news and how it functions is extremely problematic, right? News is supposed to be public good, right? News is supposed to be public good, which is supposed to inform the people, which is supposed to amplify the voices of people. But because of the business model, this whole objective is lost somewhere, right? The way it works is, um, advertisers are the ones sort of fueling the media. Now, I'll just go back to the skyscraper example really quickly. Here's how it works, right? So for instance, like we are building a mall, right? You remember we are building a mall, right? The legislature has said, let there be a mall, right? Now there are certain cement companies who want to get that business because it's a big project. They want to get that project in. They want these projects to come their way, not just for that limited 1.5 year or how long it takes doing it, but they also want future government contracts after that, right? I mean, they'll build a mall today, they'll build another mall on top of it tomorrow, and then another one. So as a business, as a cement business, when you look at perpetuity of your business, you want long-term benefits, right? So the only way in India, in a lot of ways, for big businesses to sustain and function is to get close to the government, right? Now, to get close to the government and to ensure that their businesses prosper for a long duration of time, they have to ensure that the government remains stable, right? They have to ensure that the people in power remain in power so that they will continue to give them benefits of future contracts, etc. And that's just the way things work. Okay. So what happens is that these companies which sort of also get the tenders, etc., etc., they will advertise on media channels. Like, let's take the example of Dunder Cement or whatever, like, Wonder Cement. But like, so they, it's very intrinsically linked how the businesses which are funding media houses, they want them to not point out the flaws of the government in power so that the people do not also sort of go against them, because their only source of information in a lot of ways is what the news is telling them or what the media is telling them. And if they are not getting it, then of course they'll feel like everything is going great, and the government is doing well, everything is doing great. So that is how our business model of media works, right? And it's very scary when you think about it, right? Like, if you look at it from the news channels point of view, the only way for them to survive is through advertisements, right? So they will want this, they will want more advertisers to come their way, and the way to get more advertisers is to be pro government then, because there's this pressure on the side. And for the companies on the other side, it is about stability, it is about their business profitability. They want to project a good economic picture all the time, so that there are more investments in the country, so that there is more money pouring in, so that people keep buying their stuff. So it's like a very good relationship between these three, right? And that I think is very harmful. So for the media to be a public good, it has to be publicly funded. So like I work with News Laundry, so I can say with complete pride that we don't depend on TRPs, right? We do depend on people who pay us. So whenever we get subscriptions, the more subscriptions we get, the more we are able to do. And if we don't get subscriptions, we can scale down our operations also. And that happens a lot. Like we can expand and collapse very quickly as an organization, because that makes us very nimble. And I feel like the media business model right now is what is leading to a lot of our problems, right? A lot of our problems. And as you have also pointed out, there is fake news, there is interference of government, there is TRPs. Yeah, TRP. You just saw the scandal that happened. We can talk about that during our interaction session also. So yeah, so that these are basically the four big flaws which I see in our pillars, right? Now I want to sort of paint a picture of what I think the future looks like, right? And again, I'll go back to the analogy only. uh, you are a person who is sitting on the, say, the newly built mall. uh, you are just looking around and you're looking at Instagram or whatever and shiny pictures of other things, and you know that there are like sways happening in your skyscraper. It sways every once in a while, you don't know why, but it's just like, oh, it's swaying, etc., whatever. And it's because of these cracks in the pillar. There is nobody who is going down right at the bottom and looking at these cracks and saying that, guys, we need to fix this, because the entire structure is built on this. So even if you are at the top and the media is focused at the top, the judges want to be at the top, the executives want to get transferred to ministries, so they want to be at the top. Nobody wants to go to the bottom floors and see the filth there. um, it's very essential today to sort of go down to the bottom and see these cracks for what they are, right? And this is where I began entire story with lawyers and you guys, right, and us. Basically how we can do this is by effectively communicating these cracks to the public at large, right? Because these, I feel, are fundamental problems in our democracy which sort of need to be fixed today. And unless we look at the larger picture, the interaction of like this cycle, right, this whole cycle which I described, if we don't look at it that way, we will miss out on everything. We will not be able to achieve the goals of our democracy. We will not be able to have any sort of sustainable development which benefits all the people in our society in one way or another. I mean, having an equal society is a utopian idea, I know that, but having an extremely unequal society like the one we have is extremely harmful as well. So yeah, that is where I will end this section, and we will move on to the next section, but I want to take some questions first. Yeah, anyone who has any questions, please go ahead about this entire thing or anything related to it.
Okay, so if people are not asking, I have one question.
Yeah. Go on.
Sir, do you, while we are discussing the media thing and how the recent crisis is emerging, so do you think that the subscription-based media is going to be a solution in that regard? I suppose we are law
Yeah.
students, we have Live Law. Live Law is a
Yeah.
platform, subscription-based platform, News Laundry for that matter, the print for that matter. So do you think that if as a citizen, as a law student, or as anybody, if I'm paying the things, I have more liability or responsibility that I want the information, the genuine information which I want to see, rather
Hmm.
than anything. So do you think that the subscription-based journalism is alternative to what is happening?
Yes. So, so like we give these two examples a lot. I'll give both of them. First is, Abhinandan keeps saying that, it's like a lighthouse, right? Like when a lighthouse is built, it's not like the people who have paid for the lighthouse are the only ones who are getting benefit of the light. So there are other ships that are going around which also like get that light, and they also benefit from the navigation that the lighthouse provides, right? So essentially, when you talk about public good, news as a public good, it is like that, where when you are paying for news, people who can pay, people who can afford to pay, they're also paying for the benefit of others, right? So it's essentially like if they are paying News Laundry, like say we have like some whatever amount of subscribers, but when the content I'm creating, the explainers on Farm Bill I'm creating, the whatever that requires an editor, a producer, a camera, all of those expensive things, they have to pay me, all of those things. So these guys who are paying us are essentially making sure that that piece of content is created for the benefit of those who don't pay or can't pay, right? But we do hope that more people pay, and there's a reason for that as well, right? For instance, like if you can imagine like a a business house, right? A house on top of a platform. Again, like say I'll take the example of pillars again. So like say for instance it's supported by 7 pillars, right? So 7 pillars being one of Wonder Cement, one of Patanjali, one of whatever Kent RO, Amul, right? And 2 pillars are government, right? Government also advertises on news channels. Now this media house is dependent on these pillars, right? Now what if two of these pillars go away, right? What if two of these pillars or three of them go away? What happens is that the building becomes unstable, the media house starts collapsing. So what the government can do at that point of time is like, acha, we will fill up those 3 pillars, right? But nudge nudge, wink wink, you know what we mean, right? So they can pull out at any point of time. So then you'll become unstable again, so it's not a business anymore. So that happens as well, right? You'll see that Sudarshan TV has constant ads of Uttar Pradesh government, right? So taxpayer is paying Sudarshan TV to do what they do, right? So that is what is extremely scary. But with News Laundry, if you look at it, say there are 100 bamboo pillars supporting us. 300 रुपए महीने का देके bamboo pillar लगा के we have been set up, right? Now if even 10 of these leave, we still have 90 pillars, right? We still have 90 of those, and we can actually cut down a little bit on what we are doing stories or whether we are sending out reporters, etc. But if 100 more people put in their pillars, then we can expand very quickly, we can do more projects, right? So that is the benefit of a subscription model, right? Because it's so decentralized, the funding is so decentralized that it makes it very effective when it comes to news as a public good. Yeah, so that is one thing. Oh, there is another question. What do you think? How do you think the media problems which we discussed could be solved in the recent future? So my answer lies there as well, right? The basically the public good part of news can only happen if if the, as they say, like as we say constantly, the public pays, the public is served, right? So the people who are paying the money will be served, right? For example, I'll give you one very recent example of what happened, right? So I was looking at this in this whole SSR thing that is going on for the last what, 3-4 months now, Mumbai police came out and said that 80,000 fake accounts were posting content about that justice for SSR conspiracy theories, etc. Now, if you think about it, earlier, everybody knew that, the media is not really, highlighting some issues that are supposed to be highlighted. We were thinking that, vulnerable issues were not highlighted, etc. And certain elite, as I said in the skyscraper example, certain elite issues were the ones that caught their eye and they tried to amplify it. Now it so happens that they are actually listening to bots. So essentially, if you think about it, think about how scary that is, right? Say a social media company has decided that something has to become a narrative, right? They can create fake accounts all across the board, put out this operation and float this weird narrative of a suicide which is actually a murder, and news channels will run it for 3 straight months. So they're not even talking about human problems anymore, right? So that, I feel, is one of the scariest thing you can think of, right? Because then you can think of what sort of narratives can be woven through this entire process of news, right? um, yeah, so the only way forward again is to sort of make sure that this broken business model is just defeated somehow, right? The TRP scam that happened, we'll talk about that if you want to as well. um, the TRP scandal that happened, the way advertisers fund news, it's extremely dangerous, and in times like these it becomes even worse because it can actually be used against you. That's the whole point. um, so Antara is asking, during a busy news cycle, how do you decide which story to cover? So usually, so it's an editorial call, of course. We tend to also do a lot of human rights stories, right? So, like for instance, the Hathras thing that happened. Um, it so happened that we saw this story in like one of our reporters saw this in India Today. Sorry, Indian Express, and they were already like doing multiple stories in Uttar Pradesh. They were doing stories on how the politics of caste is working in Uttar Pradesh. They were covering Lucknow ke administrative issues and a lot of other things, which you'll see on News Laundry soon. Um, it so happened that this story caught their eye, and they were near Hathras, so they went there. So News Laundry was the first on the ground there, and they were able to speak to the mother. They were able to go to the place where it happened and talk to the people around. There was zero media presence there when they went, right? And I mean, it's a coincidence that the day the story got published, the day before the girl had died. So then it became a big story, and then it was followed up by that whole burning of the body thing that happened, right? So our editorial call is essentially try to figure out what information is relevant to the people, right? Also, our subscribers give a lot of feedback. So obviously, because it's public pays, public is served, we do listen to our subscribers a lot. So we have like city-based WhatsApp groups where subscribers can talk to us directly. So the entire management is on those WhatsApp groups. Monthly, we do a NL chat box, which is basically subscribers only Zoom call, where they can curse us, criticize us, they can give us ideas, they can just basically take our case. So that is how we take our call, right? And so basically it's a mix and match of a lot of things. We have a special focus on the media, of course, so that is of course one of our biggest beat. So yeah, that is how we do it. Yeah, any other questions?
Sir, good evening,
Sir,
sir. Actually, sir, I have
yeah.
a question regarding the independent media houses which have come in the recent few years. So, sir, initially, when a independent news channel or a journalist comes up, he or she has a very vast opinion or has a very distinct opinion on the news related, like on the news which
Yeah.
they publish or show. But
Yeah.
when the time passes, slowly they incline towards I won't say a wing, but towards an ideology, and then their entire news is focused from that point. Like for example,
Right,
if there
right.
is an incident, they write in like in their own way, but at the starting, where like when they initially start, they have a very racial opinion. They talk about both the sides and talk about
Mhm.
actually the facts which we want to like read, listen, or hear. But slowly towards, like as the time passes, they shift towards an ideology and stick towards that. And then we see
Right.
that their entire genre or their entire platform is like changed or shifted to that. So what
So
is
you're
the
talking
main?
about ideological biases in news, right?
Yes,
So like
because sir,
when
when
journalists
a
display
person
ideology.
starts like independent reporting or journalism, they are very like like they
I
talk
understand.
about
I
everything.
understand where you're coming from. I
Yeah, yeah,
understand where
exactly.
you're coming from. So yeah, so there's a long answer to this. One is I genuinely do not believe that there is such a thing called an unbiased human being, right? Everybody's biased. Like literally everybody is biased. If you want to say,
For sure.
let's take an example. Let's take a very simple example, right? Lockdown happened, migrant crisis happened, right? Where like people were walking for miles and miles of across the board, right? Now let's take the example of say someone like Barkha Dutt, right? So Barkha Dutt goes and she starts from Delhi and she goes to Jaipur first, right? So to see what are the migrants doing there, etc. Then she goes further. Then she decides to go further. Then she goes to Maharashtra and all these places, and she does like excellent ground coverage of what is going on. Now, you'd say that so she's just reporting, right? She's if you look at her report, she was just sharing the stories of people there. Now, if I was to look at it, I would say Barkha is biased. Why? Because why did she choose to go from Delhi to Rajasthan and not from Delhi to Madhya Pradesh? Why didn't she go to Delhi to Himachal Pradesh? Why didn't she go to Kashmir? Right? Like so, inherently, everybody will have biases, and it can be based on environmental factors. It can be based on your resources, right? Maybe she didn't have the money to go to another place, right? Maybe she thought that the weather conditions there might be weird, or I don't know what else, or maybe the taxi driver was like, मेरा घर है वहाँ पे मैं रह सकता हूँ तो सस्ता हो जाएगा. There can be million other reasons, right? So this happens a lot in journalism, right? So stop expecting unbiased journalism, right? There will be a little bit of bias in every piece of news that you read. What you can expect from journalists is fairness, right? I think being fair is more important than being neutral or whatever. For example, again, I did this farm bill explainer recently, right? Now I have a few researchers working with me, both of them who are lawyers, right? And both of them come from a background of they worked with NGOs, they worked with big advocates who are more into human rights, etc. Now for them, they even in their research, they basically obviously read pieces which are biased in that way, where opinions are made where they are like saying that no, this is bad, APMCs are good, and this is going to destroy farmers and everything. So when I got the research paper, I was like, boss, मुझे दूसरा side भी चाहिए. मतलब what is the benefits of this, also tell me, right? So then they worked on the benefits of it. Then I saw that theoretically it's a great idea. Theoretically, liberalization of farms is a great idea. Implementation wise, it can be horrifying, right? Because we are not there yet. Like 87% of our farmers are small landholding farmers. Now if you look at it that way, if you look at my explainer, I've shown both sides, right? But now in these times that we live in, you will see that then there is this whole thing that goes on about centrism, right? Where pick a side, because it's like, why are you not picking a side? Because it's the time to pick a side, because there's clearly a powerful side, there is a less powerful side, so why aren't you in the less powerful side? Or the other is like, why aren't you in the powerful side? I mean, you can't be in the middle anymore. So journalists are also in this social media bubble of sorts, where they are also being encouraged to give opinions, right? I am not a journalist. I keep saying that I am not a journalist. I'm a commentator. I give opinions, and I tell you I give opinions. I tell you that my opinions come from an ideological bias. Now, if you want to take it, take it. If you don't want to take it, challenge me, right? that is the whole point of giving commentary and analysis on the news. MPs, my initial training was this, right? When we were told specifically that when you are giving a brief to MPs about a law, you have to give pros and cons, and those pros and cons have to be balanced, right? You can't just go like all out and say that nahi ye bura hai, because then you end up influencing the representative in your ideological sense, right? What we were also told was that once you offer it on a platter to the MP will be the one who will be bringing in the biases. The MP will be the one who will be saying, "Nahi, these pros are okay, so I will support the bill," and these no, whatever, or the other way around. So I think the job of journalists is also similar, where they give the pros and cons and they give the facts and the stories, but on top of it, the opinion makers also give their opinions on how to look at that story, right? I think that's also a very important job. So you have to make these distinctions in your head also. When you read the news, you have to also expect a certain level of bias, but you should also learn to see that bias and look at everything critically. Even if it's my work, anybody else's work, you should look at everything critically. Yeah. And there was one more person who wanted questions. I'll take that and then I'll move on to our ordinances. Anyone? There was one more person who wanted to ask something.
Sorry, sir, my doubt is clear now because the question was addressed by you.
Oh, all right. Amazing, amazing. So we'll move on to ordinances then. Okay. So guys, what do you think are ordinances? Can someone tell me quickly what are ordinances? Quick mechanism to make laws for on a temporary basis. True. That's a good way to put it. In situations of emergency, don't you think? Authoritative order when parliament is not in session. Yes, exactly. So yeah, so ordinances are basically orders issued by the President of India, which are essentially laws which are made without the approval of Parliament in situations of emergency, right? Or it's basically a judgment call made by the government of the day, which advises the President, and then the President passes a law. And then when the Parliament starts again, like when the next session happens, those ordinances are introduced as laws, and then a discussion happens, and then of course they're passed or not, right? Now there are two things. One is until the last few years, there was this situation where the land acquisition bill was always passed as an ordinance, but when the parliament session came in, they introduced the bill, they let it hang, and then they issued another ordinance, they just changed the title, right? And that kept happening, and it happened with multiple laws. So the Supreme Court came down and said that no, you can't reissue ordinances because this emergency situation, which you say had happened then, can only happen during that time. How can it be like so prolonged that during intersessions you are just keep passing that law? Now the problem with this entire thing is that I think this is a very convenient tool used by governments today to just pass laws without the approval of parliament. Like these farm bills, the farm bills were initially passed as ordinances. Now, if you ask me, why? Why did they do that? Or labor codes, why was it passed as an ordinance? Right? There are so many bills which come in. Like for instance, you might say that the ordinance that was passed to protect medical staff, right, which increased the punishment for harassment of medical staff during the pandemic. Now that is, I agree with that can be still counted as an emergency situation, needed urgent legislation because of the situation, whatever you want to call it. Farm bills though, or labor laws, or things of those sorts, do not need to be passed as ordinances. Now what is happening overall, if you want to look at it as a larger picture, is that I'll go back to the skyscraper example, is that we are in an extreme hurry these days. You know, like it's like everybody just wants everything now, right? It's we are restless, we are aspirational, we want everything right now, like development now. You know, we want to be superpower in next year, or jo bhi hai, like, you know, we want to be shiny, happy just immediately, right? We don't want to work at it, we just want it right now. And parliament is being looked at it that way as well, where it's like a soap factory ki your basically your performance will be quantitatively based rather than qualitatively based. Where quantitatively, what it means is that if you sit in parliament for so many hours, so many days, etc., we will divide up the overall budget that is allocated to parliament and say that taxpayer money was used for every minute of parliament. This is happening. So, acha, we got it. We got our worth. That actually is a narrative about parliament. Or they would be like, oh, so in the last session, which sat for 10 days, 25 bills were passed. Oh, that's great. That's excellent. We should pass more bills. Why those bills are being passed? What is the quality of the bills being passed? Whether they were sent for scrutiny, whether there were stakeholder consultations before it, that is just lost somewhere, right? Because the idea in people's head about parliament now, and this is like a gradual sort of I would call it destruction of the institution, gradual process of it, not happening in the last 6 years but before that as well. um, People just seem to think that people go there to just pass laws, which is actually true because anti-defection law, right? I mean, think about it, like that is essentially what they're doing in a very basic form, right? So they're not entirely wrong, but when you think about it, at least if you look at the functioning of parliament, it is supposed to be a place to debate, deliberate. It is supposed to be a place where ideas clash, different ideas are proposed, laws are amended. There is like you know, severe scrutiny of laws that are being passed, and then they are passed in the best way. And if you remember the cycle I showed you, if there are flaws in the future in the law, then they will be changed as well with similar process of deliberation and scrutiny. But that takes a while, that takes a long time. Like for instance, the labor codes that were passed, they have been in consultation since like the 2000s. Like multiple standing committees have come in, they have given their opinions. um, and the ministry claimed that they had sent it to stakeholders, etc., but stakeholders are saying they weren't consulted, but that's a different matter. But at least you can see that some amount of work has been put into labor codes, right? Farm bills also, the one big complaint against the passing of the farm bill was the way it was passed, right? The division vote that happened, right? Where the MPs were getting up and saying that we call for division, but the Rajya Sabha TV was muted, they were not heard, and then it was just passed by voice vote, right? So that is one of the big criticisms. The other criticism is that stakeholder consulting was not done before that. Public consultation was not done. But I feel like a lot of public consultation was done before that. Like again, farming is such a subject that has been considered by multiple standing committees before. There have been many expert panels before that, and a lot of opinions have come in. And when it comes to farming bill, the APMC thing especially, you can see that APMCs were not active in every state. Bihar had removed APMC in 2006. Maharashtra had removed it right before the pandemic, right? So essentially, there was already a process of experimentation going on across the board, across states, where in some states there were APMCs, some place there were half APMCs, some place they were more powerful. So you can choose the best model from amongst these and then come up with a plan that, so look, so this state has performed well, this agriculture sector is doing well in this state, so let's try to implement it in parts across the board in the entire nation, right? That didn't happen though. That whole process didn't happen, where the debate, the deliberation, the consultation should happen. And this takes time, you realize, because then pilot projects would need to be done when it comes to policy making. Like Manrega had pilot projects. There are bigger schemes like Right to Education had pilot projects. Aadhaar had pilot projects. So this takes time to implement. But people are extremely impatient. So the lawmaking process itself has become super impatient, and which is the scary part, because if you as lawyers are reading so much, you know what ordinances are, how they are used in emergency situations, etc. But the public sentiment is that it doesn't really matter anymore, right? Because the job of the parliament is to pass laws. So that is the unfortunate situation we are in. And I'm giving you an overall context of this. Of course, I'm not going into the details of this. And when you look at the parliament as a whole, and I just want to spend the next few minutes, I just want to understand how you see democracy and how you see parliament's role in democracy. If anybody has any thoughts on that. And I'm not talking about the current parliament, I'm just talking about the overall concept of a parliament or an assembly or a legislature. Anyone? You know, this is really funny, but this often happens in virtual classes, right? So there's this psychological experiment that was done, where in a building which catches fire, right? So if it's on a floor where there are two residential apartments, right, and one of them catches fire, the neighbor will call the fire department, say कि मेरे neighbor के इसमें आग लग रही है. But if it's in a building where there are 10 apartments and one of them catches fire, the other 9 will think that हाँ कोई और कॉल कर ही रहा होगा, right? So अभी वही हो रहा है. Like people are like, someone else will ask that question now, I think. It's like, and this happens a lot, no? See, that's why I want cameras on, guys. कुछ भी मतलब.
Guys, it will take the question will take a lot of time you to type. So please use your mic and share your thoughts. No need to go
Yeah,
on
but
typing for
Muskan
1 or
has
2
a
minutes.
question here. In our parliament system, the executive head also has a majority in the parliament, whereas the executive and legislature are two different pillars. Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very legit way to put it. But I want to go, I want you to get a little more, how can I put it, philosophical on this, right? So there is this big debate going on today on on Twitter, but mostly on Twitter, about dictatorship, if you must have seen. Right, so there's this star from South, I forget his name. He said something like, "Oh my God, we should be a dictatorship," because he gives this example of a plane where if say the passengers elect one of them amongst them to fly a plane, they will not know and the plane will crash, right? This is actually an argument used by Socrates, right? A long time ago, it was called the ship of state, right? Where he says the same thing, like, there's a navigator who is basically on the ship, which is charting a course for the ship. Now the people inside, the crew suddenly is like, "Arey, this guy's doing nothing. We are running the ship. This guy's doing nothing except looking at the stars and looking at the charts and whatever, and just telling us where to go. So it's pointless. He's just eating our food." So they throw him overboard, and then they're like, "We will choose someone from amongst us to do this, right? So to run the ship." And then they run the ship, but then it doesn't reach the destination. This is a very old argument that is used to sort of to sort of figure out who should get the vote or who should get a say in democracy. So I want you to think about it from that angle, right? So what is the importance of a parliament in a democracy? आग लग रही है, कोई तो उठाओ, कोई तो कॉल करो.
Okay, so what I think that
So I would
philosophically,
like
okay, we have a comment. Yeah, please,
Yeah,
Nissan.
go.
answer that. So, like the importance of parliament can be that in parliament we have representatives from different states. So,
Right.
like they have a say in the laws that is being made by the union, so that they can put up the interest of their states, the people of their states, so that we know the laws that are being made and people's interest through their representatives are being met in that manner. So,
Yes, absolutely. So so Shivanshu is saying can be said as the soul of democracy because it represents people. Yes, absolutely. So here's the thing, right? So we have the first past the post system A. Keep that in mind. So first past this post system, if you don't know, is when a person who gets the most votes in a constituency wins, right? So if the person gets say 30% of the vote, but the collective vote and the other vote is split between say like three other parties, the person who gets the 30% will win, even if the 70% did not vote for them, right? But then, and that is important because once the person is elected in an ideal situation, the person is representing the constituency. So whether or not people vote for them, they have to listen to their demands, right? So because they're representing the constituency, they're just not representing the 30% of people. um, that is important. Now, so when it comes to representative democracy, um, if a person goes to parliament, they're like a loudspeaker, right? So they're like a loudspeaker, and their job is to talk. Like literally, that is their basic job, is to speak, right? And the loudspeaker, the microphone is with the people. The microphone is with the people, and like of course the there if there are 100 people talking at the same time in a microphone, nothing can be heard. But it's the job of the representative to then figure out how to assimilate this information that is coming from the ground, and then use the parliament as a forum to put it forward. Now the government's job is to listen to this and then take action on it, right? Now the government can have like a million things to take care of at any given point of time. If you know, in parliament there are different ways to do this. One is the question hour, where the MPs get to ask questions to the government and the government has to respond. So they can do it in two ways: one is oral and one is written. So in an oral way, the MP who has asked the question can also ask counter questions, right? And in the written, they'll just get an answer. Now, there's another way, which is they can raise zero-hour notices, which means that matters of public importance are raised. So there is a notice that is submitted in advance to the table office, the legislative branch, and then they are supposed to read out that statement, right? But wahan par they don't get a response. They don't have to get a response from the government. If the government feels like this is an important matter they have raised, they'll respond. Otherwise, no. um, and the other thing is, of course, during debates, right? Debates would be when an MP gets to speak on a certain legislature, but that is a little limited because they have to restrict themselves to the law itself and the related issues to it, right? And another way to do it is in committees. So in committees is when the MPs go there, they basically put their points forward, and the opinions are anonymized. That's important. Like when a committee makes a report, in the report the opinions are represented as a collective, not like ascribed to a certain person. And if the MP feels like the opinion is not carried forward in that report which they wanted to, they can write a dissent note, and that dissent note has to be carried with the report, right? So that is one way to. So these are just the basic ways in which an representative can actively participate, but all of these just involve speaking. Now the parliament as a whole is this forum where people are speaking, simply put. Now there are different steps to it, as I said. One is, how active are you about telling your member of parliament what you want, right? I feel like the citizens are not usually that active. So what the MP has to do then, or their researchers have to do, is they have to reach out to the constituents and then get their opinion on things. Again, that involves a lot of resources. It involves personnel. Not all MPs have research staff to do that. So they will just look at like whatever is online, whatever influential voices talking about whatever, and then they would put forward that opinion in parliament. Uh, or if they have the expertise themselves, they can do it as well, but that's a rare case. And the other thing is that the other factor is, of course, the government listening to them, right? Now, the, who does the government listen to, right? That is also a big thing. As I said, because of the anti-defection law, the government doesn't really need to listen to anyone. Technically, all they have to do is make phone calls, and like basically, if the party leader is saying vote karo to karo. I won't take the name of this one particular MP that I worked with, but it has happened to me multiple times now. So I'll just tell you like a personal example. Um, the MP which I was advising, again, I did that thing where I have both sides presented in a brief, and then I'm helping them write the speech. Now, one particular very big legislation had come in, and they were like, no, this is just not going to work. I think the people in my constituencies are going to be pissed, because there were a lot of business communities there, etc., which had advised them that, guys, this is told him that this is not going to work. This is a very complicated system, etc. This was GST. So you know, he was like, "Acha, so write a speech which is basically obviously against the bill." I did that. I did it. I like wrote the speech which is against it. Next day we get a 3-line whip saying that he has to vote in favor. Right? Now we were in such an extremely awkward situation, because on one hand we are criticizing the bill and saying it's a bad thing, but now he is forced to vote in favor, and this is a constitutional amendment, so it's also recorded. So it's such a bizarre place to be in, right, where your constituents are saying that this is going to harm us, actively harm our business, and you are like, I agree this is going to harm your business, but I have to vote in favor, because if I don't, I'll get kicked out, right? This happened with so many other legislations. It's insane when you think about things happening like this. You get like a little disillusioned with this, because you have worked hours, and you have put in your heart and soul into reading legislations, briefing MPs. The MPs themselves have worked hard to form their opinions, talk to people, all of that, and at the end of the day, it's all about a button push. So about parliament, so like this is just the brief overview of what I think is parliament, but I would like to hear suggestions about how to improve this. Yeah, please, is there any way to sort of deal with this situation? And then we'll go back to more questions. So like, I think if you have any questions about this or anything of that sort, if you feel like you want to talk about the media, the legislature, executive, anything that I've covered, please go ahead. We will spend the next 15 odd minutes doing that now. We'll like, in my opinion, the majority in parliament is the major cause of this. I think so too, because uh, I feel like a best government would be extremely decentralized, right? So I feel like if more regional parties had seats in parliament and it was divided and there is a coalition government. I know people hate coalitions nowadays, where, as I said, it is also connected to restlessness, where they feel like coalitions don't work because they will continue fighting amongst each other and not come to a decision, right? I feel like that's actually a great thing, because if you have a majority government, there is nobody to fight with them. so they'll just do whatever, right? And then the whole process of bad laws, like if a regional, say, coalition, if a coalition of parties puts up a law, right? Say a minister from a BJP puts up a law, but they're in coalition with other parties as well. Now, say a person from, so say the leader of BJD is like, no, this law does not benefit us. This law does not benefit our state. Make changes to it, take it back, or make changes to it. Otherwise, we are exiting. Right now, this is blackmail, and people are really pissed when this happens, where tends to make the government fall whenever they are not passing a law. That happens, like, you know what I'm talking about. No, but I feel that's a great thing, right? I feel that's a great thing, because then the both the parties will have to go to a negotiating table, and they will have to come to a middle ground, which will, because their interest is to pass this law, their interest is to not pass this law, so they'll have to come to a middle ground for it to be passed, right? Because they need the votes to get it passed. It will take time, but I genuinely feel it will make a better law then. The law will be more rich, the law will be more, there will be more consultation on the law, and that is how it will work. So I feel like majority is a problem, yes, I agree, and I genuinely feel coalition governments are better. Also, check and balances will have a practical application. Yes, absolutely, exactly. There will be checks and balances there. Political checks and balances, which I think is important. Like within the institution, there is like an automatic checks and balance system.
And so even in an anti-defection scenario also, if there get to be some relaxed norm, so that the MPs from your party only can criticize the bill which you are coming up with
Right.
in the parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is this. So when it comes to anti-defection reforms,
Post-10th schedule, sir, imagine the scenario of the Congress, the vibrant Congress which used to be there. You have socialist, you have capitalist, you have left wing, all there in a single party, and they are criticizing the Nehru government or the Lal Bahadur Shastri government within a single party. So that is also lacking in this scenario. And in terms of collision, you can have a comparative working, which happened in the 5-year tenure of Vajpayee governments. Then UPA 1-2, where the women's bill was torn up in the parliament. The Congress brought the Samajwadi party torn up the bill because they are not agreeing to that. In the reservation bill, Lalu Prasad Yadav created a huge ruckus and some words were changed of the bill. So that way, it can be effective.
yeah, and also about your first point about anti-defection reforms, like basically one suggestion that was given was that again, this whole thing about basically if MPs are given complete free will to vote, then they will never come to a conclusion or whatever. That is the usual argument. But actually, we are, I think, the one of the only democracies now which have such a law, which is basically forcing like MPs to vote in blocks. Every other democracy, like, the MPs are allowed to vote. They have to do like a giant process of rallying the blocks and whatever, and then coming to a conclusion, and then that the education block is with us. And you must have seen in political dramas also, House of Cards specifically. But that's the thing. So like I think it's also about a lot about how much you can trust your representatives, right? So what we have seen in parliament in the last decade or more is constant disruptions. So essentially there's this view of parliament in people's head that they just go there to shout. What's the point, right? They'll climb on tables, they will tear up mics, they will tear up documents, which happened like 2 weeks ago, right? Now that this sort of behavior sort of makes people think that ha to sahi hai na, matlab they are being told what to vote, so because otherwise they're just shouting and screaming, right? So what if I told you they're shouting and screaming because of the anti-defection law, because they have no say, right? Because they feel like the only way to get attention now is to disrupt the proceedings, because the big party will just steamroll them anyway, right? That is the biggest fear. But the reforms when it comes to anti-defection is that, okay, fine, let the MPs vote on bills which do not threaten the stability of government. How about that? So like when it comes to say a budget or like a no confidence motion, then a whip can be issued where the MPs have to forcefully vote in certain way. But when it comes to other bills, other legislations, MPs are free to vote in whatever way they want. Now that can be one very simple reform which achieves both things, right? Again, nobody really talks about it, but yeah. There was someone who wanted to talk.
Sir,
Hi.
hello. Sir, actually,
Yeah.
my question was that the day before yesterday, I was reading an article that about the parliamentary procedure these days, and what is actually the scenario of the parliament in the working procedure and all that. So that lot of standing committees are there for the different purposes, and the article was showing that nobody ever attends the meeting or does so and so things. So, sir, what can be the role of a speaker? Speaker can be there, that if the powers of the speaker should be enlarged so that he can exercise and make the MPs and MPs to work regarding that, because all the objective of the parliament itself fails if the MP is not performing best of its abilities. So what can be the role of
So
speaker in that case?
yeah, so okay, so there's one thing that you have to understand. Like when you talk about imposing any sort of attendance rules or performance rules on parliament, I feel like that's really unfair, right? Because of course there should be, I feel like there should be a right to recall where you there are a lot of people who think that the MP is not performing in a certain way that they wanted them to, so they should be recalled. That should be there. But other than that, I don't feel there should be compulsory attendance or compulsory performance or anything of that sort, for a simple reason. When you do your job, does the boss have to call you every day and tell you कि तुझे काम पे आना है नहीं तो salary नहीं देंगे? Right? Some of you do go yourself, no, because you know that it's a responsibility, and if you don't go, your boss will pull you up and not pay you, right? In this case, we are the bosses, right? The speaker isn't the boss. The speaker is just like a just conducting the proceedings. We are the bosses, the people are the bosses. So it's a problem of, I think, also social sensibilities of sorts, or like awareness, where I don't think people vote for MPs based on their performance in parliament. The day that happens, that is when parliament becomes more effective. But that is also a question of public consciousness, right? And that is why I started off this entire thing by saying that communication is important, because when you talk about communicating laws or communicating systems or communicating what democracy does in a particular way, in a simple way, in a way that people understand, that is what builds that public consciousness, that we have a voice, we can actually make MPs work collectively, we can actually demand things, and that is why they will go to parliament, right? It's not because some random rule is saying that, oh, you have to attend parliament, because even if they attend parliament, what will they do, right? Like standing committees you gave the example of, I'm very aware that a lot of MPs do not attend, and sometimes the quorum is not met, and then the committee meeting is cancelled. Now I have worked with enough MPs who sort of initially did not really think that standing committees were important. They were like, हाँ जाना तो है, attendance sign करना है, बैठना है, and we'll come back, right? But it took like a lot of active interventions from PRS or a lot of people, which would give them simpler briefs, because before the meeting they get like these thick stacks of paper which they are supposed to read, which is confidential, and like stakeholder reports and what they have said, and there will be hearings and whatever. um, Now they need research help for that, and if the researcher is not able to communicate the importance of what this is, point out the flaws in it or what they can say in the meeting, etc., it seems a little pointless for them, right? They will come from their constituency, they will come there, they will sit in the meeting, they will listen, and they will go back. So even if you force them to come, if they are not effective, what's the point, right? So that is something you need to think about. Okay, last 5 minutes. Do you think speakers are able to rise above political loyalties? No, I don't think so. I mean, speaker is independent in just name, but all the speakers that I've seen, from Meera Kumar to um, the last one, Sumitra Mahajan, to this one, at least in Parliament, or even I think uh, I don't think they're able to. But Somnath Chatterjee was an exception. That is what people keep giving me the examples of. And I have read some old uncorrected proceedings and everything, and I see how he did it also, right? Like, it's very different, and I think it's very rare that a speaker is actually able to rise above um, political loyalties. But also, that was, like, I think it's also dependent on which government is there, right? If the government allows the speaker to act in a way that is above politics or the party or whatever, then yes, of course, they would want to be like independent of these political compulsions. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen in reality. But yeah, you will see like biases everywhere, of course. Okay, no more questions, I think. Yeah, I think no more questions. Okay, Gautam, I think we are done. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for listening in. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something. I hope you have some things to take away from this. I know it was a little random, but I hope you at least were awake throughout. Gautam? Yeah.
Yes, yes, I mean. So, thanks a lot, sir, for devoting time with us. And if I add to what Shreyans was asking, whether the subcommittees, I believe that where you raised the point that where we are a parliament, and at what is the relation of democracy. If a parliament is not in session, same time the government passes ordinance, these parliamentary subcommittees should also be a reformative, and they should be proactive. Parliament is not in session. Like they are the delegated power which the parliament has given to themselves. So they are
Yeah.
also a sovereign body. But
Yeah.
it was really misfortunate where Shashi Tharoor, IT committee, they summoned the Facebook, and the one MP from the BJP was member of the ITC, I think Shikant Dubey. He
Yes.
wrote to the speaker and said that he is acting beyond his power. So these things must took place significantly, I think, in my, because you are a delegated power of the parliament, you should be more active. Like we see the US Senate calls anyone to questions. So why
Yeah.
wait for the judicial trial? You have this up, you want the power. And also, sir, on point of what changes you are requiring in parliament to function. A few days back, I hope everybody should have read. A few months back, there was a piece by Shashi Tharoor in Indian Express. He talked about totally shifting away from the first past the post to electoral executive. So that was more. I don't know what I am not able to balance that whether we should totally change away our system, or whether this is the idea of the person whose party is not able to win a single election. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's also like about representative voting is one more idea that people keep floating. But if you want to like just not make many changes and like small changes, one interesting thought experiment would be like, for instance, like I have spoken to like a bunch of people about this and tried to come up with ways about how to stop disruption. Because according to me, as I said, the visual of how a parliament is supposed to function is important, and the biggest visual that people take away is the disruption, right? So how do we stop that? And I think it's very simple. You have like the parliament functioning for say a month like for say 25 days, right? Like working days. You give every Friday for the opposition to set the agenda, राइट? सो यू आर लाइक फ्राइडे को तुम्हारा दिन है, तुम करो, लाइक तुमको जो करना है, मतलब यू ब्रिंग अप योर इश्यूज, यू टॉक अबाउट व्हाट यू वांट, यू ब्रिंग अप योर ओन बिल्स इफ यू वांट, एंड यू प्रेजेंट देम लाइक entire day. Your speaker will sit there and you will be the ones in charge, right? The rest of the 4 days we'll do it, but the one day you will do it. And then you can also extend the session for 5 more days, so that that opposition thing is also done, and like you also have, you don't miss out on working days, right? I mean, it's a very very simple solution that you can come up with tomorrow. The speaker can say tomorrow that this is how it will happen. The deputy speaker is usually from the opposition side of things, so on Fridays the deputy speaker will be in charge, and on the other 4 days this speaker will be in charge. I think that will be one thing, because then the opposition can't say that हमको बोलने नहीं दे रहे, या फिर हमको ये नहीं करने दे रहे, हमको जगह ही नहीं मिल रही है टाइप्स, हमारे इश्यूज नहीं रेज हो रहे, because you get an entire day to raise the issues. Do it. Like, and the best part about parliament is that you can extend it, so like it doesn't end at 6 or 5. You can extend it for as long as you want. So Friday ko it can go on till like 12 in the night if you want. Like go on.
Even in Corona advisory, the parliament was supposed to 6 o'clock, but there was days the parliament set to 11:30, 11.
Yeah. I've seen it happen as well. Nirbhaya debate, there was GST debate. There's so many times when parliament has sat till midnight and like kept working. You can do it. Karo.
So thank you, sir. In your initial remark, you said that I don't know why I was being called the topic. So based on your lecture only, I can say that this is the reason why I want to call you. Because if there would have been a professor, if there would have been a senior advocate or practitioner, we would have talked more about Article 75, the Council, Article 123, where the president gets the power to frame ordinances. But we would have definitely missed these insights and practical experience from a person who have worked so closely with the MPs and all. So thank you so much, sir, for bringing this so much insight to it. I must say this
Thank
was
you.
very very informative. And
Sorry to interrupt you. I had a question.
Yeah. Go on.
Talked about ordinances for the protection of medical workers during this pandemic, right? So I had a question that since we are talking about the ordinances and we talked about the pillars of our democracy, so don't you think that ordinance, like the question was put that Section 3, it violates the principle of the presumption of innocence. So can the executive make a law which is in contravention of the laws that is made by the legislature and the principles that has been incorporated in our criminal jurisprudence as well? So I had a question regarding that.
Okay, but like, what is the question?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, what is the question exactly?
So I had a question like, can the executive, like through its ordinances, violate the principle of the presumption of innocence? Because Section 3. Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay, so like that, this actually this question also came up during the land acquisition, I think, when, if I'm not wrong, because there were Aadhaar, it came up during. I think Aadhaar was the one that it came up during, where they had passed an ordinance which essentially went against the right to liberty. And also like the right to privacy was not defined then, but like right to liberty, because a lot of people said that the executive cannot pass ordinances which would go against the very essence of the constitution also, right? But the point is that when a president passes the ordinance, it is done on the advisory of the government. It is very difficult to question the president, right? The courts cannot call the president willy-nilly because they have basically passed this ordinance. And since it's the president who is passing this ordinance on the advice of the government, they can't really call the government either. So that's the problem. That's the essential problem. So the only accountability here is that Once the session starts, the ordinance expires, which is a great thing. So it's not a law anymore, and they have to bring it in as a bill, right? And then they have to pass it. Otherwise, they cannot reissue it, right? So that is one of the ways to think about it. Like, even if it's like a violation of presumptive innocence, or like even the basis of basic rules of the constitution or whatever it is, it's at least still temporary. That is one way to put it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir, but I always have a question in my mind as a law student, that we have been also taught, like we are taught that legislature makes the laws, but it is the president who makes the final assent, and that bill becomes the law only with the assent of the president. But the president is the executive. So, but we are taught that legislature makes the laws. So, I find it very contradicting.
Oh, that way. Yeah, I mean, I guess you're right, because um, it's also, again, like, what is that section? I forget, where it says that the president has to listen to the Council of Ministers. It's in the Constitution somewhere. Can anyone tell me? I think there's a section. I forget the what it was. The article. Uh,
I guess it's 53 or 73, I guess. 73.
Article 73. Yeah. So like basically the only thing that the president can do, realistically speaking, is sit on it. So they can just like delay signing the legislation, right? And I think they can send it back once, but if the government sends it back, then they have to pass it, right? I mean, they have no other power than that. I can't really answer your question, because I also have like the similar sort of view that you have, but I feel like it's procedurally speaking, maybe it needs like some sort of authenticity for it to become a law, right? So like when the legislature passes it, it's fine, but like thappa lagana padta hai na, like to give it like that seal of approval of sort. Yeah, this is final. So I think that is what the president does. Like when they call him a rubber stamp, I think it is actually the seal of approval that he's giving, where this becomes like authentic, or like this is the Union of India, which is basically making this a law. So I that's according to me. I mean, you'll have to talk to better legal experts for a better answer to this question.
This was the pretty much the scenario when first the constitutional came into existence, because as Rajendra Prasad was there as the chairman of the Constitutional Assembly, and the person who knows what all the discussion has gone while drafting the constitution. So when he became the president, he took those articles very literally. So anything which goes for the assent of the president, he used to hold that. That I have the power, and you are my government, functioning as my government. So there was incident. If you people read Grenville Austin, then there will a delegation sent by Jawaharlal Nehru, where Radhe Krishna Swami Iyer and Professor K.T. Shah went there and see this was not the idea where the institution of presidents was got created. You can't withhold every bill with you, and that is from where that goes to change to into a rubber stamp. So Rajendra Prasad was very rigid in this concept and interpretation of the constitution. So it's constitutional interpretation of the president. Anytime you can change the scenario that you want. So
Sir, I think in that case, Mr. Kalam has done a commendable job.
I think
in
Kalam
that
also
case,
sat
Mr.
on a
Kalam
few
has done a
bills. Yeah. Kalam also sat on a few bills. I remember. I vaguely remember. I don't remember which it was, but he also did like a. Yeah, I agree.
So, once again, thank you so much, sir. On behalf of Society for Constitutional Law and Human Rights, I thank you for you. I hope we will connect with in future sometime for lectures
You
and
can
practical
DM
experience
me,
too.
you can DM me on Twitter anytime my Twitter DMs are open, and also on Instagram. So
I'm also thank you that your Twitter DMs are open because I was able to find you through
yeah,
that. So,
yeah.
thank you so
So
much.
I check my DMs regularly, so you can just text me there. Okay, bye guys. Thank you.
Bye guys, see you all tomorrow for constitutional amendment procedures for 368. We will discuss there tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining, and once again, thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks.